Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haje. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find transcripts and additional information about each episode on autistic.fm. In this episode, I'm joined by Nikki Butler, an incredible advocate and voice for the late diagnosed autistic community. Nikki shares her deeply personal journey of navigating life pre and post diagnosis, including her profound relief and self compassion that she discovered after learning she's both autistic and has ADHD. Her story is one of resilience as she discusses what it took to move beyond survival mode and into a life that feels authentic and fulfilling. We talk about the impact of masking, the challenges of unraveling a lifetime of societal expectations, and the healing that comes from finding a community that truly sees and understands you. Nikki opens up about the moments of grief, self-acceptance, and how she's learning to embrace her unique strengths without shame. Her insights offer a powerful message to anybody who's striving to connect more deeply with themselves or to better understand the lived experiences of late diagnosed autistic individuals. So for this episode, I have an extended trigger warning. This episode includes discussions of mental health challenges. It mentions suicidal ideation, childhood trauma, workplace toxicity, and emotional and physical dysregulation. We're talking about toxic relationships, systemic injustices, and grief related to a late autism diagnosis. It's an absolutely beautiful episode, but please do take care of yourself and listen at your own pace. Let's dive into this incredibly beautiful conversation with Nikki Butler. Let's roll tape. Hello, dear guest. I'm so psyched to have you here. Would you tell me your name and your pronouns, please?
My name is Nikki Butler and she, her.
Wonderful. Where in the world are you?
I'm in Hampshire in England, very beautiful part of the countryside.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm excited to have you. I have a couple of questions that I ask everybody, so let's start there. When and how did you realize you might be neurodivergent?
Oh, so a few years ago, so I'm trying to think, about 4 years ago, how it first came up was with ADHD. I had 2 people in the space of a week ask me if I had ADHD. Um, I'd always known I was different. I always felt like I wasn't like other people, right from a really, really young age. And, I've always felt on the outside. But when 2 people asked me in the space of a week, one was a friend and one was a business coach. And I remember thinking, that's odd. And I went straight onto Google and went down an absolute rabbit hole. And probably did 4 months worth of research before I thought, I'm sure this is me. Went to the doctors, got referred. In the UK at that point, there was around a 4-year wait list for adult services. So
Okay.
I
Good job you don't
I
need any help for the next 4 years.
it's worse than that now. It's now around 9 to 10 years.
What?
But I ended up going privately, but with the help of my GP. So they referred me, diagnosed ADHD, and during that diagnosis, the psychiatrist said, I think you're autistic. And that was hadn't even crossed my mind. But again, when I looked into it, all made sense. And from there, I was referred and diagnosed autistic as well.
Was that a curveball for you?
Yeah, it was, but also it felt like this huge relief because, I guess I'd always labeled myself as like I was always called the eccentric one. I was quirky. I was always kind of on the outside of friendship groups and did everything I possibly could to sort of fit in, but was very consciously aware that I didn't quite fit and belong and had felt like I'd spent my life almost stuck in hard mode, like really, really struggling. And when suddenly there was this like, oh, that's why, that's all of the little pieces started to fall into place. And I think what I'll always be grateful for is it gifted me this immense amount of self-compassion and helped me to release a lot of shame. It was almost as if that went overnight, but on the other side of that, I had to deal with a lot of grief. So that kind of grief of being diagnosed in my mid-40s was then about what might my life have been like if I had known, because I've lived on my own. Like, I'm 50 next year and I've never been married. I don't have children. I've lived a very isolated life, desperately hiding those parts of me that I didn't want people to see and having this kind of, outward persona. So I had to grieve a life I felt I might have had. I never experienced anger, which is interesting because I speak to a lot of people that But yeah, it feels in many respects for me like a gift of self-understanding and an opportunity to make some intentional choices with my life going forward, so that, the life that I have left feels really rewarding for me, feels like I can be authentic. But it was a curveball, but I would describe it as a beautiful curveball.
What were the parts of you that you were hiding from the world?
So, so many parts. So there's parts of me that, outwardly I had a very successful career. So I was, had a corporate legal career before I'd been self-employed for over 10 years. So all my energy went into that, into like the professional external, but inwardly it was chaos. So I struggled to maintain, like, keep my house in order, if you like, almost feeling like, why is it so difficult for me to tidy up and put things away? And I remember reading a book called The Queen of Distraction, which was how I learned to tidy up, which sounds bananas at like in my 40s. But I always felt really ashamed that I didn't have this like show home, and that how people perceived me wasn't the reality of how I was. I suffered with super low self-esteem. Like, I had spent a lot of my time with people telling me that I was too much or not enough, or pointing out my flaws. Friendships and relationships are incredibly difficult and incredibly painful for me, because I feel like I feel other people's emotions really richly, like crushingly, and been a people pleaser for decades. So I became like this master chameleon of flexing into whatever somebody needed from me, no boundaries, compromising myself all the time. Um, and I had really, and still experience, like RSD, so rejection sensitive dysphoria. So any perceived criticism would bring me to my knees. And I didn't want people to see the things I couldn't do well. I didn't want people to see the meltdowns. So I would quite often come get into my house and close the door and almost just sink behind the door and have the meltdowns where I don't really talk about this, but I'll share it because I think it's important. I would almost just rock on the floor and hit my head to re-regulate, to decompress. And then when I decompressed, it would stop. It was like I could get up and I could carry on, but I had to decompress and release all of that anxiety and the struggles of like the day. And I never wanted people to see that. Like, I didn't think anybody would understand. Um, and I find like I just don't like people in my space all the time. There were so many parts that I thought I was fundamentally broken. And I would have told you I was rubbish at adulting. If you'd have pre-diagnosis, I'd been like, how can this be so hard? I am useless. I'm rubbish at adulting. And my energy and efforts went into outwardly being a certain person and being successful in a societal way, if you like, in a way that, society would go, woohoo, you've made it, whilst being absolutely crushed and incredibly lonely and isolated in reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And in that moment, so you come home from work,
Mm,
you collapse in a pile in front of your door inside the
mm.
house. You're like, I'm safe. I can collapse.
Yeah.
Was that scary for you? Or is like, oh, everybody does this kind of thing?
So I thought everybody did that kind of thing. I genuinely, and I remember when I was younger, for as long as I can remember it, I did it, because I remember doing it relatively young as a child. But I would almost put a sock in my mouth and cry in my room, like absolutely cry. And I was born in the 70s. Like, it wasn't a sort of generation where we were open about our emotions and we talked about how we felt. It was a bit sort of very stiff upper lip, like stoic, get on with it. And so I learned to conceal that. So I assumed other people were doing that. Um, the point at which I realized that, or the point at which it became scary for me, was when I was in corporate, and it was getting to the point that I would get in the car when I left work and cry all the way home, an hour. driving all the way home, and I would get home and almost be inconsolable. Like I was so dysregulated. And I remember on a November evening having been through that process, driving home and getting close to home and thinking I could drive my car off the road and I wouldn't have to do this anymore. That night, I got inside my door and I was scared. That night, I felt this is not what other people are experiencing, and this feels really frightening for me. And it was the catalyst of my resignation from my corporate job.
Yeah.
Really became something else in that moment.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's almost creepy to hear you say this because I've had a almost completely parallel experience. And
Wow,
hearing somebody
really?
else say that, yeah, I was working as a TV producer for a while, and I was commuting from central London to Reading, which is about an hour, but I was doing that by motorbike. And, March in London on a motorbike,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
raining, it's miserable.
yeah,
But that motorbike ride was like the thing that kind of kept me sane because I was like, okay, you've got to pay attention. You have to be like,
yeah,
and just having that focus of keeping myself alive on the
yeah,
road was like, but I was so stressed and so dysregulated and so like, at one point it flashed through my head. It's like, if I just had a little motorbike accident, enough to put me in hospital for a few weeks, I wouldn't have to deal with any of this shit. And I was
yeah,
super confused because like, wait, is this what suicidal ideation is like? It's like, no, 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 I specifically don't want to die. I just
yeah, yeah,
don't want to do this. And a few weeks in hospital seems like a reasonable trade-off. And that's, I resigned very soon after. I was like, this,
yeah.
like, I cannot think like this. And so I'm feeling I have literal like goosebumps right now because
Wow,
like hearing you explain this, I think is the first time somebody's truly mirrored that experience for me. Thank you.
wow. Oh, well, thank you for sharing that
I
with
never,
me
never told
because
anybody this. So there's that.
no, but but uh,
Yeah.
but it's I think like I really appreciate that because I think these are the moments that it really goes through my mind how many other people have had or are having these experiences where outwardly the people around them maybe think, you're doing fine, you're doing great. And inwardly, it's like, make this stop. It's so overwhelming, overstimulating, and has like an impact on a level that I think is quite hard to articulate because certainly from my experience, it was a whole body, whole mind experience. Every part of my body and my mind was so dysregulated and like out of sync, and it was terrifying. And similarly to you, it wasn't that I was thinking about I want to do this because I don't want to be here. It was the case of like, make this stop. I can't. Um, but what was interesting, I did resign, and I resigned with no idea what I was going to do. So lived on my own, house, car, all the, adult responsibilities, and I quit. And I remember the relief, and I remember thinking, you need to remember the relief because it's going to be this roller coaster of what have you done? This is crazy. But what I wasn't prepared for, number one, was the whole body shutdown. I had a year of almost within days of leaving, I could barely string a sentence together. I would have a panic attack in Sainsbury's and have to leave. I couldn't even get my shopping. But the overwhelming feeling of shame of like, you are useless. You've proven you are a useless adult. You 36 years old and you have dropped out. Like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, like just so, and I was obviously undiagnosed at that point. And I think that part of my life, the biggest gift was seeing that experience through a different lens. And now I think, like, like, go me, like, how did I like spend over a decade in like corporate and in these like crazy situations bouncing from meeting to meeting. So now I'm like, let's celebrate there, because it was every kind of hell. But at the time, it was that societal expectation of, you have a career, what does success look like from a societal point of view? And when I couldn't live up to that and crashed out of that at 36, I was so deeply ashamed that I retreated in a way that I'd never retreated before.
Yeah, I hear you.
And
It
it
is so fucking hard. And I think
yeah,
like I've done a whole bunch of startups, and after every startup, I had like a stretch of like what I now know is burnout. I thought it was depression, but none of the depression
yeah,
tricks and medicines worked, right? And I'm like, oh, cool, you can
yeah,
take all these drugs, you can do all
yeah,
these exercises, but nothing touched it.
yeah,
So I now recognize that that was burnout. But in that moment in burnout, it's like the voice that became very loud was like, oh, everybody was right. You are not good enough. I was like,
yeah,
oh no. And I am stubborn as fuck, right? I will
yeah,
do anything to, like, I have made so many choices in my life because people thought I couldn't, or because I thought I couldn't.
yeah,
And I'd be like, no, I can do anything, right? And then I
yeah,
prove them wrong. And in the process, put myself into all these weird pretzels of like,
yeah,
oh, I don't like this doesn't
yeah,
feel comfortable, but I did it. I'm like,
yeah,
okay, well, that's a whole thing. And I'm now recognize that is actually a form of pathological demand avoidance.
yeah.
Where I'm like, somebody says I can't do it, well, I will do it just to prove you wrong.
Let me show
It's
you.
right, right. And it's like, what? Who am I doing this for, right? And of course, this is one of the recurring themes that happens when I talk to people about this stuff. It's like, oh, like what's true for me is that my internal like sense of who I am gets so confused that I need
Yeah,
somebody else to tell me that I'm good enough or that I'm the whatever, right? And so I've done a whole bunch of cool stuff, but
yeah,
very few of them I did for me. It was like to prove that I was worthy. And what it boils down to is like, prove that I'm worthy of love, right? And that's a fucking
yeah.
grim place to be.
I mean, God, that resonates with me so, so much because, you know, I see some of the memes out there that may always make me giggle, which is tell me I can't do something and I will make it my whole personality to prove you wrong. I can do it. And I have had multiple experiences to the detriment of me, but I'm like, I'll show you. But equally, on the other side of that, if somebody tells me to do something, even if it's something I want to do, I'd be like, nope, not if you're going to impose that on me. Nope. But that feeling of like external validation, like I lived my whole life waiting for other people to tell me I was good enough, that I was smart enough, that I was capable, that I was worthy of love. Because, growing up being acutely aware that you're not like other people. And, I've still got my school reports. Like, I was lucky that my mum kept my school reports that we had for my diagnosis. And they're littered with the classic, like, um, you know, needs to concentrate more, easily distracted. But the one that stings me the most is she's arrogant, but I don't think she means to be. And I was 11. And I'm reading these reports thinking, all of my school reports are all about where I lack, you know, nothing about she's got like an amazing creative brain or she's kind, or it was all like the deficits. And I think we can go through our lives with that constant feedback on our own dialogue and our how we navigate those experiences with our internal negative narrative, always looking for the evidence that supports where we left. And so that becomes almost like a weakness based mindset, as in we're focusing on our weaknesses rather than really understanding the strengths and what we're good at. And so therefore looking for somebody else to say, well done, you're brilliant, or, you've excelled, which rarely happens, right? People rarely actually do that. So we go to the
Well,
next
surround
thing.
yourself with different people.
Yeah. But yeah, because and that's what I
Yeah.
do now. So since my diagnosis, I even sort that out in relationships. I look through my relationships. I'm like, I'm literally, what am I thinking? I'm still like going, or not now, but like prior to the diagnosis, like I was never going to find genuine love or that feeling of worthiness in the type of patterns or sort of relationships or friendships that I had, because until you recognize what's going on in yourself, I think was certainly hard for me to recognize some of the toxic patterns that I kept repeating.
Yeah. And you know what the real bastard is of that? You will go back to them again and again because that's familiar, and the unfamiliar is even
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
scarier, right? And so we're in this horrible pattern of like,
Yeah.
uh, I do a bunch of workshops where in one of the workshops, one of the exercises is three people, one on your left ear, one on your right ear, and one
Yeah.
in front of you, just say nice shit to you, like things they've
Yeah.
noticed about you for 1 minute.
Yeah.
I tell you what, that is the most consistent way to send me into meltdown because like
Really?
my brain goes to, why are they lying to me? Like, why are they lying
Mm.
to me? This cannot possibly be true. And I've done
Yeah.
this with people who know me deeply,
Yeah.
right? So it goes from why are they lying to me to, wait, what if this is true? And even just telling you that, like, um,
Ah,
to like, oh God, what if 10% of what they're saying is real? Like, what
yeah.
if I'm not a horrible person? Right. And then
Yeah.
I'm catching myself in like, oh, this neural pathway runs so deep that even
Yeah.
people who know me deeply, love me, spend 1 minute
Yeah.
saying nice shit to me, I lose it. What a sad, sad existence, right? It is so scary and so sad.
I mean, there's so many parallels because I'm hugely uncomfortable with compliments, with positive feedback. I automatically assume somebody's just being kind, that they're just saying nice stuff to make me feel good, but it's not true.
Right,
Um, but I have really tried to do some work on internal validation. And I did some what I was about to say, what year are we in? 2024. It was this year. I did some brilliant NLP training with Sue Knight, and I absolutely loved it because I learned to receive feedback for the first time, positive feedback. Actually, it wasn't just positive feedback. But positive feedback where I just said, thank you. And I didn't try and find a reason why that wasn't true, which would be my default. Oh, no, no, that was just a one off. But I listened, I sat with the positive feedback and I said, thank you. And the really challenging bit was when I got some constructive feedback. One of the NLP beliefs that I adore is there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. Now, to show up on this course, it was done remotely, and to listen to constructive feedback without the RSD just coming crashing in on me, I had to think, right, there's no such thing as failure over only feedback. And it was going through my head and going through my head. So I learned to receive constructive feedback without thinking I was useless, without that real crippling fear of judgment and not being enough, and thinking, how can I learn and grow? And that was amazing, to sit with that quite deep feedback and not spiral, but then also to sit with the positive and just say, thank you. But I have to concentrate on it. Like if you paid me a compliment in the street or in any other situation, I'd flip it as a joke, I expect. Interesting.
yeah. Well, it's
Mm.
deflection, right? And I think this is where masking is actually really interesting too. If you're out there masking and somebody gives you criticism, but they're actually criticizing your mask, then it's like, oh, they said something that's critical of me, but really it was the thing I held up in front of me. So they are
Yeah.
attacking my shield. Fine, that's what the shield is for, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the people you let in beyond the mask, who can actually like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where it gets real, like real.
And I'm just processing that because I don't have a huge amount of people in my life that probably get. I don't outwardly mask anymore, but what's been interesting since diagnosis is my circle is closed because I want to be me. I want to be completely authentic in my existence and how I'm showing up and who I am sharing my time and my energy with, right? And I want that to be as positive experience for me, but also for others. Um, because interestingly on masking, something that I really struggled with for a long time was often the things that people would assume about me or say to other people about me were nothing like me. And I'd be like, why do you think I'm like that? And be super offended or super confused. But the reality was I was masking and I didn't know. So I used to describe my corporate job that I would step onto a stage, act out the role at work, get off the stage, come home. I was me at home. I'd implode. I was safe. I could just, you know, get under the weighted blankets and just be me and be quiet. But I hadn't, until discovering that I'm autistic and I've got ADHD, processed the magnitude of the gap between who was showing up externally and who was at the core. And I really think I lost me. I did lose me. I didn't. Took a lot of work post diagnosis to really connect to, like, who am I? What's important to me? Like, what does it even mean for me to show up as me? But I remember so vividly that feeling of almost being, you know, hit with a sledgehammer of like, why do these people think that I'm that person? But it was the mask.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. And so you say your circle is closed, and I recognize
mm,
that. And then at the same time, I'm like, what compelled you to come on this podcast? Because you feel like you're showing up fully, right? So now,
yeah,
thank you for briefly allowing me into your circle, but there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people who get to experience you like this.
yeah.
Does
And
that
I
cause
think
any
this
sort
is
of?
any sort of, were you going to say
Oh no,
anxiety?
you were. I was going to say anxiety, but maybe
Yeah,
I don't want to put the words in your mouth. Like, what is that experience? To me, this is incredibly liberating. I get to fully be me, and if people don't want to listen, they don't have to listen.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm
I love
curious.
this. I was so excited to be here, and there was not one part of hesitation because something that is like really at the heart for me is I do not want other people to relive the life that I've had because it's not been horrendous, but it's been incredibly lonely and isolating. And I really felt like I was broken, fundamentally broken. And that kind of being able to reflect and think about, I said about like grieving, like what life might I've had if I'd known and I would have made different choices or just be really connected to who I was and able to show up without shame and like, but if I can share my experience and my stories, number one, I'm thinking, how many other people out there are feeling this and think they're the only ones feeling it, or don't kind of have, it's only when you share these stories and are like profoundly honest about it that I believe we're helping other people to go, that's me, that resonates. I mean, look at just the short time that we've spoken and things that are really parallel that I've not spoken to anyone else that's had a similar experience with corporate and that kind of feeling of I need to step off the hamster wheel in that way. But I also have a great deal of sadness around the stereotypes and the stigmas that still remain that are potentially impacting people that will still mask because they're afraid to show up themselves because of the consequences or the fear of judgment or the fear of rejection. And I think that when we can have open conversations, we like shift those stereotypes, we remove the stigmas, we change the narrative. And that can only be positive. And I want that to go out into the world with that huge ripple effect. And one of the ways I look at it is whatever I say and share, like, and this might sound a bit like bizarre to say, but I'm not married and I don't have children. So I can be wildly honest without the same level of concern of the impact on others. So I don't have to consider, like, what a partner might be feeling if I'm sharing these truths or these stories about how I felt, or and that is why I think that I have, like, the ability to share a story and use my voice to talk about some of the stuff that others might be experienced but might not be comfortable to share, and that we can build that community, that understanding, help people feel like they're not alone, and that just keeps growing. That's why I love doing, like, this kind of thing. I'm really happy to be as honest and open as I can be.
Yeah, I love that. You've mentioned kind of shame and regret a few times about
Mm.
um, do you have like an obvious like forking choice in your life where you're like, oh, if I'd known, I would have made a different choice? Like, is there anything that springs to mind where you're like, oh, that thing would have been very different?
There's a lot of those moments. There's a lot of those moments. So the one that immediately springs to mind, I super struggled with education. So I always felt with education, my efforts, my results never reflected my efforts. And so I didn't do great with GCSEs that we have here. And because I struggled so much with exams, I went to college and I did something called a BTEC, which meant no exams, all project work. Huge mistake with deadlines, because the deadlines for the projects, I'm like, couldn't manage my timescale. So, but I scraped through. And then I went to uni and I started a law degree. So 18 years old, started a law degree. And I was a disaster. I was away from home, like, access to loads of alcohol, partying. I genuinely can count on one hand the number of lectures I attended. That was it. So much so I dropped out after a year. And everything about that experience was horrific to me on so many levels. But I dropped out, I worked for a year, and I went back to university and did my law degree. Now, what made me go back was the shame I felt about dropping out from doing a law degree. I felt like I should. When I was at school, you was supposed to pick a career and follow it and have a study path and a career. And I felt so much shame that I dropped out of uni, and I went back, and I genuinely don't know how I got a law degree, but, well, I tell you how I got a law degree. I literally rewrote the books. I thought everybody didn't really know how everyone had the time to party. I was copying from one book to another book, to some cue cards, to some wall charts, to everything in colour. And I got a law degree, and I laugh at the ridiculous amount of effort I put in. I wouldn't have put myself through that had I had been really true to myself. Um, that was very much from a place of shame. I was bullied at university, didn't enjoy it. Um, but also my corporate career, because I then went into working, got a law degree, I went to work in private practice, went to work in corporate, from a legal point of view, because it was expected. And
Right.
I didn't, it's so much about my life that I just think that's where the kind of, I don't know if I'd call it regret, because I think that I'm a huge believer in everything we experience makes us who we are. And a way that I've learned to deal with things is, I believe that life happens for us, not to us. And so I would always look for what have I learned? What can I take away from that? Um, where can I use this story or this experience to my advantage? Like, I wouldn't be able to share it with you now, right? Any of the stuff that's happened to me,
Right.
wouldn't be able to share it. So I'm not sure I see the regret, but I feel a sadness in putting myself through all of those experiences I'm really forcing myself to live my life in hard mode and to compromise every part of who I am multiple times over, I feel I wish that could have been a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that echoes very loudly from what you're saying is like my life could have been so much easier. Like it
Yeah.
didn't have to be so hard.
Yeah.
One, I think it's intriguing too that you mentioned being bullied and not loving that, which makes sense. But then choosing a career where you know the legal profession has a lot of like strong arming and bullying like behavior in it in general. And
Mm,
like if you're anything like me, like a lot of us have an incredible strong sense of justice, which makes sense from the law point of view. But the way law is
yeah.
practiced often, I don't know, could you say something about that? Because that feels like it might be very challenging.
That sense of kind of justice and fairness, it's funny because I've mentioned it on a post on LinkedIn only a couple of days ago, actually. I've always had that, and that's definitely what drove me into law. What drove me into law was, do you know the author John Grisham?
And the
Yeah.
firm
Yeah, so, that
and
is
the
why
Pelican
I ended
Brief
up
for
doing
that
a law
matter.
degree.
That's an interesting choice there. If I read that book, I'd be like, maybe I don't want to be a lawyer.
Well, I was obsessed with John Grisham books when I was younger, and I'm like, "I am gonna be a criminal barrister. I'm so gonna be a criminal barrister." And I got to my second year of my law degree, did criminal law, sat in court, went home crying every night. I'm like, "No, that I can't cope with that." So I went down a very different type of law, but I didn't choose areas of law. So contract law was like a big part of what I did. So facts, like, in terms of like that kind of thing. But where the sense of justice and fairness came in for me was company cultures. So how people were treated. I went into leadership relatively young. I think I became a manager at 27, I think I was. Um, and my belief is everybody that's there has value. Everyone's doing it's like a big sort of load of cogs. Everyone's got their part to play. And I don't believe one person is better than another. Everyone just has a different role. So, I mean, I look back for my managers now and in some respects I feel sorry because what I would have said to you was, I don't understand hierarchy. I would have said, I don't understand corporate hierarchy or the culture within big organizations. When I reflect back on that now, I think it would be more honest to tell you, I understood it all right. I just didn't believe in it. I do not believe that you have to blow smoke up someone's arse because they're two levels ahead of you in the corporate chain. I think building good relationships and having that open communication and having respect for everybody, wherever they sit within an organization, is absolutely critical. But, and that was the sense of fairness and justice for me, was people being treated fairly and with kindness and respect. I really struggled with that. I really struggled with seeing people unnecessarily being treated poorly or in more of a demeaning way. And I would do everything I could to right that.
There's nothing
I
worse
honestly
than a
think,
manager who really could have done with some therapy and takes it out on other people.
yeah. And it's not leadership. Like, I'm like, like, it's not leadership. If you are having that way of being within an organization that's so toxic and people are going home crying because of how you're acting, or you're just passing other people's ideas off as your own, like that sense of fairness and justice, like I struggle with that daily. I really struggle with that. Um, but it was definitely what drove me into law because the initial love of law was criminal, but the law is never fair.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I live in the US and the way it's done here is absolutely shocking. And I think
It's not
there's
even
this
consistent,
interesting
is it?
thing. What's not consistent, and 97% of criminal cases are plea bargain, which means they're never even heard. You never get it right that phase. It
Yeah.
is obscene, which means that who actually goes to court? Well, if you can afford a lawyer and if you're willing to fight,
Mm,
right? Which means now
yeah.
you're talking about socioeconomic, which means you're talking about racism, which means you're talking
Yeah,
about, and
yeah.
the whole system is just
Yeah.
absolutely fucked. And whenever I do any amount of reading about criminal justice and how it's done, and then
Mm,
add to that, the entire prison system is privately run. So there's financial incentive to
mm,
put more and more people in behind bars. And once you know those two pieces, you're like, oh,
yeah.
wait. Now you're talking about generations and generations of people who have no way out, end up in jail, and
No.
people are profiting from it. I'm like, that feels like the sense of justice I have, I
Mm,
see. I had I did a lot of studying about this a few years ago. I was on stage, I was interviewing people about criminal justice and through the
yeah.
lens of technology. And I just got too angry. I was like, I can't make meaningful change here, and this is
Mm,
fantastically bad for my mental health. I get so
yeah.
angry. I'm like, I can't do this. I have to step away. And I'm like, well, I
Bill.
could have been a good ally here. Maybe I could have done something to help, but I
Yeah.
don't have it. Um, so
And
yeah,
I think that is the thing, isn't it? Like I had a really interesting conversation actually when I was diagnosed with somebody, and I were talking about my love of criminal law. So how I'd ended up doing a law degree, and somebody said to me, "You'd have," realizing I was autistic, "You'd have been great at that because you'd have been able to switch your emotions off." And I was like, it was the absolute opposite. I remember sitting in court and feeling everything and feeling like I was thinking I can't do this as a job because I would be sat there sobbing all the time, and I would go home and replay these cases that I had, like, been sat in court listening to over and over again. And I think if you really have a strong, or for me, that feeling of I need that kind of fairness and justice, to keep replaying something with no ability to influence it or to find that justice, that true justice, would that level of anxiety and that level of what I want to say is like of feeling sick. I like it actually makes me feel physically sick to my stomach. That level of suffering and injustice in the world is very difficult to process.
do you feel that feeling right now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's why when I was kind of like looking away, and you can
yeah,
see I
yeah,
had my hand on my stomach.
yeah. I want to pause for a second and say, what do you do with that feeling? How do you let it burn off? How do you process it? What do you do? How do you get out of this tiny moment of feeling
Yeah.
physically ill?
So when I have, well, way that I've kind of learned to develop, or that I've sort of, I guess, developed, is if I have that feeling, that sense of unease, I will visualize it, imagine it as if it's a cloud in the sky. I taught this to my nieces as well. And I just think this is temporary, like as it leaves, this too shall pass. And I almost visualize it going over as a cloud would in the sky. And it's as if it will pull out and release that temporary anxiety state. And I remind myself it is a temporary anxiety state. Um, if I was on my own feeling something like that, I would do some breathing exercises. And I have something called a PEMF mat. It's like a holistic mat that's meant to mimic the vibrations of the earth. And I would lay on that. That recenters me, recalibrates me. But I have to consciously release it
Yeah,
because it would I would carry that feeling, the physicality of the emotion, if I don't imagine it as a thing and release it.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. The reason I wanted to pause and kind of dive into that for a moment is that a lot of the time, mean, this kind of things happens to me all the time, right? But I realized I tried to think my way out of something that was a body problem. Like
Yeah.
visualizing a cloud, yes, but that is my head trying to do the thing. And the
Yeah.
problem or the thing I'm experiencing is in my stomach or in my chest
Yeah.
or wherever, right?
Yeah.
And I went to a number of workshops recently that were deeply um well, they were sexual in nature. But the interesting thing
Yeah.
was like that happens in your body, right?
Yeah.
Um and there was a lot of emotional release exercises that came with that, like them a whole list of them. And the
Yeah.
one that really kind of worked for me whenever I'm having exactly that experience you're describing,
Yeah.
it sounds ridiculous, but it's a hand scream where you literally shout into your own hand. And I'm actually
Huh?
tempted to show you. So where basically you just place one hand over the other
Yeah.
like that, and then you just scream. And it
Yeah.
does something to your vagus nerve. It does something to your, like your entire body is like you have to clench your stomach. You
Yeah.
have to get it out, right? But then I feel so much lighter. And the thing is,
That's
the what I
amazing.
always find is that my temptation is to go, oh, I feel really, but I have to finish this call. And now I'm like, I go off video, I do a quick hand scream, I turn video back on,
Mm.
and I'm back. And it has been such a
Oh,
relief.
wow.
Like just letting
Thank you
my
for
body
that.
just have that emotion, let it come out.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't work for everybody. But my big
Yeah.
breakthrough with that was realizing, oh, emotions in the body, you can't think away. Like that
Yeah.
doesn't work for me anyway. I
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
away
Yeah.
emotional things.
I mean,
Yeah,
I do
thank you
find
for letting me
breathing
do that
exercises.
quick segue. I think
Yeah,
it's
no,
just
I
such an
love that
interesting.
because I'm gonna try that. But because the I guess the biggest thing I rely on is the breathing exercise, like the box breathing, because that really
Box breathing is great.
um yeah, because it kind of really calms the nervous system, and I use that so much. Um,
Would you tell the listeners and demonstrate what box breathing is?
box breathing. So I would breathe in for a count of 4. So I'll talk through it first, and then I'll demonstrate. So I breathe in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4, and hold for a count of 4. So I'll demonstrate it. I'll be like, then I would go through that cycle maybe 10 or 15 times. And
Mhm.
a really good trick, if sometimes my brain will be scrambling, I'm trying to kind of bring myself back into my body to calm. If I'm struggling just with box breathing, I'll find a window. And so I'll go across the top of the window, breathe in,
Yes.
down the side of the window, along the bottom and up. And being able to connect the breathing to as many senses as possible, or even tracing it if you've not got a window, even tracing that box on your hand or, drawing it on a piece of paper, a way to connect as many of the senses as possible in that
Yeah.
moment. I and that's another thing I use if I'm outside, that kind of the senses I will think about, I'll start to kind of really bring attention to what can I hear, what can I smell, see, can I taste something? Like it's because that bringing yourself back in takes away the focus and attention on the thing, the difficult moment.
Yeah.
I do,
It
yeah, that's
reminds me a lot of the
something really,
techniques people use to bring somebody back from dissociation. It's like,
yeah,
look around the room, find a blue thing,
yeah,
find a red thing, name the
yeah,
blue thing, name the
yeah,
red thing, say your own
yeah,
name, say it again, find
yeah,
another blue thing, touch your
yeah,
nose. Like just
yeah,
dumb exercises, like not dumb exercises, just like giving somebody something very specific to do
yeah,
that then very briefly breaks that
yeah.
that like
Because it doesn't need
frozen
to be
fear
complex,
moment.
does it?
Yeah, it really
Sometimes I
doesn't. And
think,
you can do that like anywhere. And there's a fun one for that I talked to someone like, oh, I can't do a hand scream. I'm in meetings all the time. No, but you can clench your butt. Like
yeah,
nobody can tell. You just
nobody
really
can
tightly
see.
clench your butt. It's like nobody can see it, but it's like it's a very specific sensation that lives in your body
Yeah,
that you can really just go to town on, and it doesn't harm
yeah, yeah.
anything. And they were like,
No,
wait, but like, no, nobody can tell. I promise. If they can, they just think you're a little weird, but that's okay. It's better than the
yeah,
alternatives.
and
And
I
I just
think
think
that's
there's
so
so many things that you
important.
can do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, in fact, but I'm definitely gonna try the hand screen. Um, because
It's a
like
good
that.
one.
But I think what I love about that is sometimes in those moments they can become so all-consuming that the best thing is to release it in the moment, isn't it? Like, because then you can
Yeah.
release it and you're back. You know, if I'd taken like 10 seconds to do that on this interview, if I'd have been like struggling or processing something, I could immediately have come back and been re-engaged rather than sat there thinking, I'm holding something or this
Yeah.
feeling, and I'm going to
And I
teach
think
it to
it's
my.
such a powerful thing to just normalize. And there's a whole bunch of those.
Mm.
The set I taught has the set I learned has 7 different emotional relief techniques. Some of them you need a pillow for, to either punch or
Yeah, yeah,
scream
yeah.
into or whatever. And some of them you can just do. Some of them you need a mat. There's one that's like literally inviting you to do a tantrum. Just and it's
Wow.
so relieving because it's just like, yeah, actually my entire body just wants to have a tantrum now. Let it. And then like
Look, I
it
love
literally takes a
that.
minute and then you're fully like
Well, I
reminded
think
me of
that's
all
so
that.
cool. But what I also love about that is, oh my goodness, to teach that to kids. Like, so that because I just think how amazing would it be, like, at the moment, like, I'm really want to sort of try and I've got young nieces, and I just think I'm really passionate about helping them just have emotional resilience or understand how to deal with things as they're growing up because life's tough, right? It's not the fairy tale that we see in Disney.
Right. Right.
So to have some really simple and fun ways that, like, I immediately smiled as you said tantrum because the thought of having an all-out tantrum fills me with so much joy
And just
because
give
there's no
yourself the
rage
permission.
attached to it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, right, a lot of the time, like there's a couple of catches that catch me in these things. Like a lot of the
Yeah.
time people equate a autistic meltdown with a tantrum. Those are very different. Right. And I get very like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but those are different. And if you allow yourself to have a meltdown, great. If you
Yeah.
allow yourself to have a tantrum, great. But you're
Yeah.
choosing to, right? And
Choosing.
the other thing that
Yeah.
kind of gives me a little crunchiness here is like, it's great to have this as a tool,
Yeah.
but you should do it for like I invite people to do it for them, not so they can
Yeah.
continue with the meeting. Right? It's not like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah, yeah.
activated. I'm going to go off camera. I'm going to shout, and then I can be
No.
like, no, do it for you. And the reason I think that is important is like, otherwise, it's just another form of masking.
But in that moment, so I'm just processing that. If I was overstimulated, if I was over you needed a moment,
Right.
how I would have dealt with that, and if I'd wanted to go off camera to just scream into my hand, it would have been for me. It wouldn't be, but that's a really interesting point because it wouldn't have been to have pretended that I was fine. It would have might just have been that I might have said something that had an emotional or cause a feeling or an emotion within me that I wanted to release in that moment, knowing it would help me recenter. But that is a really interesting point about if it's used in a way to mask what's really going on.
Yeah. And that's why I felt a little like I saw you had a reaction. And I was like, hey, but giving you a tool and saying, hey, let's do a hand scream together. It's like, no, that's not like it's for you to
Yeah,
choose. It's not for
yeah,
me to kind of impose something on you so we could continue with this interview. Right. And I think
yeah,
this is where there's some interesting thing. Like, are you doing this for you or are you doing this for somebody else?
yeah,
And I often struggle there with like, oh, why am I doing this? Um, and
yeah,
sometimes sitting with discomfort is actually really helpful for me. And
yeah.
I'm like, okay, I just actually want to sit here in this discomfort. And if that means I can't continue this phone call, so be it, you know?
So something that I've really learned to do that was new to me with like just you mentioned sitting in discomfort. I have learned to do exactly that. And I think I try to let go of the need to always know what that discomfort is about. Something that is very true for me is if I might have a feeling of discomfort, and I have very poor interoception physically in terms from a health point of view. So I, for example, where somebody might feel unwell, they notice they've got a headache or a stomach ache or their shoulder hurts, I will go from I feel fine to you're not safe, all the alarm bells go off. And so my interoception isn't amazing. But what happened for me for many, many years, decades, is I would have discomfort in some form and I would search for it. I would search for why. What is it? Why? Where does it come from? Why am I feeling that? Why have I got discomfort? And now, one of the things that has really changed for me is with that discomfort, I sit with it rather than trying to
Yeah.
attribute it to something. And
Yeah.
that in itself, not needing to know what is that about. So how I would describe that, I can't remember where I saw it. It was on an app or something, Headspace or something. But they had this great little kind of diagram of a road, and all these cars are going backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And the person was sat on the edge of the road, and they sort of explain this discomfort or the chaos, internal, whatever it might be, as if you can just sit with it and stay at the side of the road, it will pass, you will be fine. The problems come when you jump in the road and start trying to redirect the traffic. And
Yeah.
and that's where I noticed that I could cause a lot of inner chaos by trying to redirect the traffic or to find the destination of all the cars, if you like. And I've really learned to just sit with discomfort without immediately needing to know what that is and why. And if it dissipates, then that's fine. And if it doesn't, then I can work through that. But that's really helped with my anxiety, actually.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me at some point that any emotion lasts 90 seconds.
Oh, wow,
And if it
really?
lasts for longer than, I don't know if it's true.
Yeah, yeah,
I think I said this on an episode the other day too, but for the sake of a thought experiment, what if it were true? Then
yeah,
you need to figure out what's fueling the emotion,
yeah,
right? Because if it lasts for longer than 90 seconds,
yeah,
clearly what's going on?
yeah,
And there's definitely some truth to that, right? Because
yeah,
if you're feeling very angry and you hand scream for 90 seconds, that anger is gone.
yeah,
Unless something is refueling the
yeah,
anger, right? Or if you're scared and you manage to get it out of your system and
yeah,
you continue to be scared. Okay, what is that fear? And sometimes that makes sense, right? But
yeah,
I think a lot of the time, human bodies aren't very sophisticated when it comes to knowing what level of fear is the right amount of fear. Like you're either scared or you're not scared. Like right now, it's December 11th. I don't really know how I'm going to pay my rent at the end of the month. But am I going to be scared for the next 20 days? Or I'm
mm,
just going to go, well, one way or the other, I'll
yeah,
figure it out. And if I don't, that's okay too. Like the worst case scenario isn't that.
yeah,
And so the mental jujitsu there is choosing your emotions. And the first time I heard that was like, that feels like bullshit. Like
yeah,
I'm not choosing my emotions; they're choosing me. It's like, am I though?
mm,
Because it turns out like perspective and NLP is very, very powerful
yeah,
for this. Obviously,
yeah,
like at some point, I had a friend who I was working through a lot of anxiety and stuff, and he was like, "Where do you stand to make coffee?" And he showed me. He's like, "Okay, let's do a magic trick." And he walked me over and said, "Imagine a circle on the ground right in front of your coffee machine." I was like, "Okay." When you step into this circle, you are safe,
mm,
life is peaceful, and nothing bad can happen
mm.
to you as long as you don't burn yourself on the one. That's the only thing you have to worry. And I was like, well, that sounds weird. But from that day onwards, whenever I'm like, whatever, I go and make myself a cup of coffee. Now I drink way too much coffee, but that's a
Yeah,
different conversation. Um, I go and make myself a cup of coffee and focus only on not letting the water burn.
yeah,
And it's such a
wow,
controllable thing, right?
yeah,
And I was like, oh, this is me. This is mental jujitsu.
mm,
But when I'm making a cup of coffee, I'm feeling safe. I'm
yeah,
feeling in control. It lasts for only 5 minutes, but in those 5 minutes,
it's
and
powerful.
it's been such, right? And after I step back out of the circle, it's like, hey, I was fine for 5 minutes. Can I be fine for 5 minutes outside this circle?
Yeah,
Can I be fine for 10 minutes?
yeah,
And it's just, on the one hand, are we totally just gaslighting ourselves into being okay? Maybe. But if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid.
Do you know what? That's exactly it, isn't it? If it works, then, something that I actually developed this. I was in a horribly toxic relationship with somebody who was narcissistic, and I remember devising a way to cope with his behaviors as I would imagine I had a bubble around me, this invisible protective bubble, and it, covered my feet, everything. When I walked, the bubble moves with me. And all of the things he said, all of the negativity, in my head, I imagined them like it was bouncing off this bubble. And so when the words came out, what I did is gamified it into like a computer. I don't play computer games, by the way, but I somehow went, right, let's make this a computer game. And all the negative words were going ping, plow, plow, all those kind of not. And all I saw and heard were this all bouncing off of me, and it wasn't reaching me. And I stayed in a calm state because I created an invisible bubble in which I existed and could not be touched. And I use it all the time, but I think that from like a mind point of view, to be able to make that choice that I have created a safe way or safe space to exist
Yeah.
shows how powerful it is when we apply what some people might think sounds like, a little bit off the wall, but it works.
Right. They actually use that in Tantra a lot, creating an energetic bubble
Do
to keep
they?
yourself safe while you're doing energetic work.
Yeah.
And you can do that with yourself. You can do that with yourself and a partner. But
Yeah.
however you do it, it's actually really powerful. And the cool thing is that once you've made your bubble, you can choose to eject things from it. I eject fear. I eject
Yeah.
whatever. And you could choose to pull things in. I invite gratitude. I
Yeah.
invite thoughtfulness. I
Yeah.
invite a longer fuse or
Yeah.
whatever it is you need, right? Um, and it is just, and I think it's just a form of mindfulness.
Yeah.
So you're like, oh, I have this protected bubble. Do you? Well, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, if it works.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, actually, since we're demonstrating stuff, can I show you?
Yeah. Go for it.
It's just like, you kind of just start from like your prayer position and then you just make a bubble with your arms.
Oh,
And then all the way around, all around your feet. And now I'm in a bubble.
I
And
love
I
the
don't
physicality
know.
of that.
Yeah. And actually doing it with your
Yeah.
arms because you're present with it in that
Yeah.
moment. And if I'm really struggling, do it slowly.
Yeah.
Really imagine drawing this bubble.
Yeah.
And is it Northern California woo bullshit? Maybe. But if it works, right? And that's the thing. And the beautiful part of it to me is like, hey, from this bubble, I eject grief.
I
It
love
can come
that.
back later,
Yeah.
but for now, it needs to not be here.
Yeah.
I eject being worried about my rent.
Yeah.
I eject, oh, I don't know if this recording is working right now, but I'm just not going to worry
Yeah.
about it. And then, if it comes back, you can say, hey, friend, you weren't welcome in the bubble. How'd you
Yeah.
go? And it's this, again, it's weird mind jujitsu, but I think like it becomes a practice like meditation, like
Yeah.
all this other stuff. And I think if a listener's listening to this and goes, this is absolute hogwash, great. Don't use this tool. Find one that works for you.
I was
Try
thinking,
it, right? What if
yeah,
it works?
exactly. Take what you need and leave the rest. That's what I
Right.
always kind of say that, like, absolutely, if something doesn't work, take what you need and leave the rest. But it, I often think about this, that like, we're not designed for the society that we live in anymore. Like, everything's moved so quickly, so fast paced. I think we have really skewed, like our bodies and our minds can't process true fear and danger. We that kind of cortisol and adrenaline and that fear response that would have happened, back in the kind of cavewoman days, whatever you want to call it. Like,
Yeah.
when you were faced with a genuine like risk to life and a threat and the body had this appropriate response. I think we have, in many respects, my feeling is we have like misappropriated fear where we live in these high stress states and we're on high alert and we are responding to micro stimuli all of the time that we can't process, and finding ways to manage that or manage the mind in whatever way works for somebody. I just think that should be celebrated. I think it's,
Yeah.
we
Yeah. And when was
need
the last
that.
time you were chased by a tiger through your corporate office?
Yeah.
Probably never. For most
No.
people, probably never, right? But that's what our mind is doing. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm about to get eaten by a tiger.
Yeah.
It's like, no, no, no. You're about to have an uncomfortable conversation with a manager. That is different from being mauled by a tiger. But our
But
body just
we
doesn't
just don't
know.
know the difference. So the response state
Yeah.
is the same, and that really sort of, and I probably do give a little bit too much thought to it because I worry. I've got, young nieces and I worry for them. And I just think I grew up when social media wasn't, a big, well, it didn't exist. So I lived my childhood and my younger years off grid, thankfully. But
Yeah.
I think that level of pressure and stimuli and, you know, more information coming in from more channels and you've got access to, everything worldwide, we're so stimulated. And how do we find those moments of calm? And certainly that's something I really recognize sort of with my own like autism and ADHD in terms of my energy levels. That is absolutely vital. I've got to find the space to recharge and not, I mean, I am not a huge social media user because I can't cope with the level of stimuli, and I find everything upsetting. I can't even watch an advert with an animal in it without crying. I'm like, I can't then be
Yeah.
exposed. I mean, I do quite like a cat video on Instagram, but but that's soothing to me watching little, animals do cutesy things, but I can't take that much stimulus. I have to find ways to work with my brain.
Yeah. To totally to downregulate and
Yeah.
to, I mean, it, if you've never done this, and to the listeners as well, if you've never done this, just search on YouTube for downregulation exercises.
Yeah.
There are so many amazing ones where there's like humming exercises, just all sorts of things you can do to kind of help your
Yeah.
body into a more sensible place. Hey, I am so appreciative of you coming on this podcast. Thank you so much. I like to close these out with two standard questions, if you don't mind. And the first one is, what do you wish people, especially neurotypical people, knew about autism?
I wish they knew that everybody's experience is different. And I wish that people would step away from the stereotypes and the stigmas and the assumptions and start to believe the lived experiences. So if you've got someone in your life that is autistic, to take time to understand what their autism means for them. How does it impact them? And to be curious, to have a loving curiosity about how you might support them or better understand them or connect better. And whatever they tell you, believe that that is true. So I think that's so vital because one of the most damaging things is somebody says they're autistic, like, and it's happened to me more times than I care to remember, to say, "You don't look autistic," or "I wouldn't have said you're autistic." And something that I think is very important to understand is that a person's autism is not based on your experience of them. It's based on our experiences, what's happening
Yes.
internally, what our lived experiences are. And you may be seeing a very highly masked or measured version of us. So take time to understand what our autism is for us and how that shows up and how you might better support without the assumptions and stereotypes.
I love that. Thank you. And can you tell me of a time where you were seen and loved exactly the right way for you?
You can see I'm struggling with this one, can't you?
I can.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the struggle?
So the struggle, and I think this is quite important actually. So I can think of something. So I will say that in a minute. The struggle is, it's linked to the last point. It's linked to how I just answered the last question. Is one of the biggest hurdles I've had is sharing being autistic and ADHD has been the response of, you don't look autistic, I wouldn't have said you're autistic, and varying degrees of that. I had a lot of people that rejected that diagnosis, so refused to accept it. I had people that made assumptions and dropped me from their life like a hot potato. Like suddenly, it was like I wasn't me, and people that had been in my life for a long time vanished, and other people treated me differently. Um, and I've also had to deal with a lot of people that have made assumptions about me and I'm quite open about my neurodivergence because it's so important to me about sharing these lived experiences. And I still feel that sting when I can see a judgment being formed. And that struggle is being diagnosed later in life. So being diagnosed in my mid-40s does make it difficult or has for me made it difficult to unravel a life pre-diagnosis, to grieve it, to release the shame, to lean into self-acceptance and understanding, and then to set my life on track for the life I want to lead in the way I want to lead it with boundaries. I mean, some people did not want me or expect me to have any boundaries, and that changed. So I am building some new connections now, and people in my life where I'm showing up and but they're new. So it's that patience, it's that time to get to know each other. And interestingly, the majority are also neurodivergent, like either autistic or ADHD or both. Um, and that struggle is building the trust with other people and the trust in myself to just show up as me after over 4 decades of masking.
Yeah.
But where I feel completely seen, and actually I love this because it's the first thing that sprung to my mind is with my niece. Like it's like she's really young, and actually both my nieces, it's that purity of kids to just embrace you as you are with no judgment. So I feel like that is where I feel like I can be seen for who I truly am, because I don't feel any expectation to be a different way. They actually have never experienced me like in any other way than me. Haven't masked them. They're little, but I haven't masked for them.
Beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
Your immediate reaction, was that one of grief? It's like, oh, why haven't I experienced this more often?
Yeah. And it was definitely a sadness. It caught me. I felt a catch in my throat. It was yeah, and I guess even just asking that question now, me processing it, did you see the uncomfortable shifts? I just shifted my body position.
Yep.
And interestingly, I put my arms around myself. So that's what I've done. Is the grief and the sadness is around, if I had known sooner, would I have had like a really loving relationship? Could I have been married and had children and had a fulfilling life with somebody that I really felt able to be myself? Um, that was that initial catch of what might that have been like for me? And I know that that can still, not in terms of kind of, I mean, ironically, I don't actually want to get married, and I wouldn't have children because I'm nearly 50. So it's not that I feel like that is possible for me, or that I long for that, but I know that there's hope for me to meet somebody and show up as my true self. But there is definitely that, wow, like, what might that have been like if I had not spent decades thinking I was fundamentally broken and unworthy of love, or that if I showed up as me, I would just be rejected, because that's how I lived. So that
Yeah.
that was a combination of that kind of grief and sadness. But again, I guess the reason I wanted to, I guess, share that, and even share that the shift in the body language for self-protection was, maybe there's other young people out there thinking, well, they resonate with the conversations that we've had, and maybe that kind of hope or ability to recognize themselves or feel like there might be another way. Because this is what I don't want for people. I don't want, whole strings of, or decades of, generations of people reliving this. And I think my
Yeah.
my gift, or my what I can share with people, is the rawness of the experiences, to hopefully, like, enable people to recognize themselves and make different choices, to reconnect with themselves, and to feel that hope and ability to love themselves and know that they're worthy of everything, of all of the greatness, and that they're not broken, and that freaking amazing. Um, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate you joining me, speaking so freely, and doing what you do.
And thank you so much. It's been, yeah, I feel like I've shared loads of stuff that I haven't shared before. So thank you for creating a safe space for me to do that. And yeah, I've loved it.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok on Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, or on the web on autistic.fm. On our website, you can also find a link to our newsletter, which I send out whenever we do a new episode, with some additional resources and news from across the world of neurospiciness. The podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haje. If you know somebody who'd be a great guest for the podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us on hello@autistic.fm or reach us on the socials. See you very soon.